Last time we spoke about the 100 Regiment Offensive. During Phase 3 of the 100 Regiment Offensive, CCP forces in the Taihang-Zhujiang area emphasized strongpoint attacks and transportation warfare. Rather than trying to defeat Japanese units head-on, they used tactics such as night raids and ambushes to disrupt Japanese supply routes and communications. The underlying goal was to make Japanese logistics unstable, weakening their ability to maintain control and conduct effective operations. After CCP successes, the Japanese responded with large-scale mopping-up operations beginning on October the 6th. As the 8th Route Army continued resisting, it adopted flexible methods to counter the Japanese sweeps, especially rapid repositioning and targeted ambushes. One notable action involved an ambush of a Japanese convoy that caused substantial enemy losses, demonstrating how disrupting enemy mobility could blunt the effectiveness of larger Japanese operations. Overall, the situation remained fluid, with both sides continually adapting their tactics in the ongoing war for North China. This episode is the Hubei-Henan Campaign of 1940 to 1941. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before I begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on my YouTube channel, I just released a rather silly episode looking at the relationship between a Japanese Nambu pistol sword of World War II and how it might have inspired the gun blades seen in Final Fantasy VIII. I know, it's quite a stretch. If you were looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 39 episodes and ongoing at this point. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. By 1940, the war had settled into a grueling stalemate, with Japanese troops occupying vast swaths of central China, including parts of Hubei, but facing persistent Chinese guerrilla and conventional resistance that prevented total consolidation. In the aftermath of the Battle of Zhaoyang in the summer of 1940, Japanese forces had secured the key cities of Yichang and Shaxi, along with the middle reaches of the Yangtze River. Yet Chinese nationalist troops of the Fifth War area retained firm control over the vital territories east and west of the Xiang River. Their defensive lines formed a broad arc stretching from the southwestern portions of Yunnan through Jingmen, north of Jiangxian, and the rugged foothills of the Dahong Mountains, extending northwest to Seychuan. These positions straddled both banks of the Xiang River, anchored on the right by the Wudang Mountains and on the left by the Tangbei Range. Working in close coordination with guerrilla detachments operating in the southeast, Chinese units repeatedly harassed the Japanese garrisons that had pushed into Yichang. The constant pressure on the enemy's flanks left the Japanese forces in Yichang and Shaxi dangerously exposed and hemmed in, unable to expand or consolidate their gains. To the Japanese high command, the situation had become intolerable, and it needed to be remedied. Under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist government faced severe strains as the war with Japan escalated. Its problems were not only military, but also political and economic. Deep ideological and territorial rivalries within the CCP meant that efforts to present a single front were constantly undermined. Although the two sides officially formed a united front in 1937, earlier violence and competition, such as the 1927 Shanghai Massacre and the CCP's Long March of 1934 to 1935, had left distrust and strategic differences in place. As a result, nationalist resistance was harder to coordinate than it would have been under full unity. Meanwhile, the CCP strengthened its position in northern China by expanding rural strongholds. Through land reforms and the use of guerrilla warfare, the Communists were able to win local support and apply pressure to Japanese forces in ways that often did not require large conventional armies. This strategy also drew influence and manpower away from the nationalist, more traditional, state-centered military structure. Economically, the nationalists were squeezed from multiple directions. The loss of China's coastal industrial regions to Japanese occupation forced the government to rely heavily on the interior, with Chongqing becoming a key base. That geographic shift left the administration more vulnerable to shortages of critical supplies, especially raw materials, fuel, and modern weapons. On top of wartime disruption, the global Great Depression intensified fiscal and logistical difficulties, limiting how quickly and effectively the nationalists could mobilize resources for large-scale operations. By late November of 1940, these weaknesses intersected with renewed Japanese pressure. Japanese commanders were also concerned about the possibility of a major nationalist push, particularly fears of a counteroffensive by the 31st Army Group under General Tong En-bo. Determined to break the stalemate, the Japanese launched a major offensive in late November of 1940. Preparations had begun in earnest earlier that month. Engineers repaired and expanded highways and bridges, constructed new defensive works and airfields, and stockpiled vast quantities of rations, ammunition, steel-hulled boats, and rubber rafts in the Zhongshan area. 5 regiments were concentrated near Zhongshan, while additional troops east and west of the Xiang River brought the total strength to more than 3 divisions. Along the Sui-Xian-Xiangyang Highway, Japanese forces were reinforced to divisional strength, supported by increased artillery and tank detachments. These meticulous measures left no doubt the enemy was ready for a large-scale operation. By November the 23rd, the Japanese had completed their deployments and moved into assault positions. The Japanese forces assigned to the central Hubei operation were placed under the overall command of Lieutenant General Wachiro Sonobe, who directed the campaign from his headquarters in Wuhan. Sonobe's 11th Army drew on a broad mix of formations, combining units from the 3rd, 4th, 15th, 17th, 39th, and 40th Divisions. The offensive backbone for the thrust into central Hubei province was reinforced by the 11th Independent Mixed Brigade, which helped supply the infantry strength needed for sustained fighting across difficult ground. In practice, this multi-divisional structure reflected the 11th Army's key mission in the region, acting as the main Japanese formation after the earlier Battle of Zhaoyang, and it emphasized coordinated divisional advances supported by attached brigades and specialized elements, including limited armor capabilities. In terms of manpower, the Japanese force is commonly estimated at roughly 40,000 to 50,000 troops. This strength included several infantry regiments and artillery batteries, along with only limited armored elements rather than fully armored formations. Because the operation depended on finding and exploiting opportunities quickly, it was supported by aerial reconnaissance and bombings carried out by the 3rd Air Brigade, operating in central China. Infantry units formed the majority of the fighting power, with artillery being used to provide suppressive fire during advances. Air support, meanwhile, was intended to help identify and target Chinese positions, particularly along important riverine and rail corridors, where disruptions could slow resistance and complicate Chinese reinforcements or retreats. To manage the operation across varied terrain and combat tasks, Sonobe's command used smaller combined formations, often described as task forces, that could operate with some flexibility. Among them were the Kagoshima Force, commanded by Major General Koichi Kaishima of the 18th Independent Mixed Brigade, consisting of the entire brigade, reinforced by elements of the 40th Division. The Muragami Force under Lieutenant General Kizaku Muragami, commander of the 39th Division, which included the full division plus supporting non-infantry units. The Hirobayashi Force, led by Lieutenant General Morito Hirobayashi of the 17th Division, formed from detachments of the 17th and 15th Divisions. The Kitana Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Kenzo Kitana of the 4th Division, incorporating portions of the 4th Division, and the Kuzuze Armored Force. These 4 groups were deployed in parallel around Tangyang, Jingmen, Zhongshan, and north of Jingshan. The Hanjima Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Fusitaro Hanjima of the 3rd Division, was positioned near Suishan along the Xiangyang-Hua Highway. This task force approach helped tailor combat power to specific mission profiles, such as flanking movements, raids, or pressure on Chinese defensive lines. Equipment choices also reflected the tactical environment of Hubei. The Japanese units made use of their Type 95 High-Go light tanks for reconnaissance and for anti-infantry roles, typically best suited to reconnaissance, pursuit, and screening functions that were available even with constrained armor numbers. For fire support, the force relied on conventional artillery, including 75mm Type 90 guns for field engagements and 105mm howitzers for heavier bombardments, where stronger explosive impact was needed. Together, these assets were intended to allow Japanese formations to maneuver around Chinese positions and apply pressure in rugged landscapes where rivers, roads, and railway lines often determined the rhythm of battle. Logistics were a decisive factor in whether the operation could sustain momentum. Sonobe's army depended heavily on existing transportation infrastructure, particularly railway lines radiating from Wuhan's hub towards forward areas such as Suizhou and Zhaoyang. These routes were critical for moving ammunition, replacements, and other supplies closer to the front as the Japanese advanced. The campaign also used river transport along the Yangtze River, including motorized barges and steamers, to deliver supplies to units operating near the waterways. However, reliance on these corridors came with risks. Chinese interdiction raids could disrupt shipments, forcing convoys to be escorted and increasing the time and resources required to keep the forward units supplied. Overall, this dependence on rail and water networks highlighted a central operational challenge, maintaining secure access to transportation arteries in contested territory so that the Japanese could keep fighting effectively. The central Hubei operation was driven by an intelligence assessment that Chinese troop movements were signaling preparations for a nationalist counteroffensive. Acting on that interpretation, the Japanese began tightening plans and positioning forces early in the final days of November of 1940. On the 23rd, Sonobe began organizing for the offensive in central Hubei. As mentioned, he broke up his forces into 5 groups, each tasked with moving in a way that supported the broader pincer-style pressure on the Chinese positions. The approach also reflected lessons drawn from the earlier Zhaoyang-Yiqiang campaign earlier in 1940, when Japanese divisions had been able to cross the Han River at multiple points, such as Dangyang, Jiukou-jian, and Shayanzheng, to help secure access towards Yiqiang and the Yangtze route. Logistics were built around infrastructure the Japanese had already established during prior operations. The Hankou hub supported the 11th Army through the arrangements that included munition storage, medical facilities, and transportation coordination. Supplies and reinforcements were moved using truck convoys and river crossings, while forward depots, such as those at Shayanzhen, northwest of Hankou, provided additional capacity, including freight handling and field hospitals. Because the area was not secure, these supply points were also guarded against threats from guerrilla activity. Operationally, the offensive used limited artillery and air support, reflecting Japan's constraints and directives aimed at keeping the campaign short and avoiding commitments that could stretch units beyond their logistical reach. Instead of trying to grind down Chinese defenses through prolonged bombardment, the plan prioritized speed, reconnaissance, and focused disruption. Japanese intelligence preparation relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance over the Han River to locate Chinese positions and infer where resistance would likely concentrate. That information enabled Japanese units to coordinate select maneuvers, including converging pressure from different directions. Where river transport mattered, coordination with naval or riverine elements supported movements and resupply. The overall oversight connected to the China Expeditionary Army. Anticipating the coming assault, the Chinese Fifth War Area Headquarters acted swiftly on instructions from the National Military Council. Orders were issued to the River West Army Group, the Right Army Group, and the Central Army Group to employ a flexible defensive strategy, hold key positions firmly while committing the main strength to strike the enemy's outer flanks at the decisive moment. The 59th Corps was directed to advance towards the Sangfang area, ready to reinforce operations on either bank of the river as the situation developed. As commander of the Fifth War Area, Li Zongren arranged the defense to meet a likely Japanese thrust along the Han River, particularly in the approaches to Wuhan and Yiqiang, following the wider stalemate that had settled in and after the fall of Wuhan. The Fifth War Area could draw on roughly 300,000 troops, though many units were under strength, and the overall readiness varied by locality. Among the formations Li Zongren placed in the most sensitive sectors was the 31st Army Group under General Tang Yinbo, which Japanese planners had identified as a potential threat to Japanese intentions in the region. In keeping with the terrain and the limits on manpower, Li's defensive design relied heavily on natural barriers, most importantly the Han River itself, and on the defensibility of rugged ground. Forces were arrayed to hold or contest riverbank positions, supported by fortifications, trenches, and smaller auxiliary elements. Divisions such as the 44th were positioned with an eye towards slowing an enemy crossing and forcing the Japanese to fight for difficult approaches rather than moving rapidly. At the same time, irregular forces and prepared defensive works were used to complicate Japanese reconnaissance to make it harder for the attacker to coordinate a clean operational flow. Strategically, Li Zongren leaned on elastic defense rather than attempting to win decisive battles at fixed lines. Regular units were supported by guerrilla-style harassment intended to strike Japanese vulnerabilities, especially supply and transportation, between forward bases and the front. Local operations, including actions coming from areas such as Xinjiang, were designed to disrupt Japanese logistics in periods when the nationalists were still managing shortages of ammunition and medical supplies. Militias in the intermountainous regions further reinforced this approach. Instead of seeking costly frontal engagements, they concentrated on disruption, delaying movements and making Japanese operations slower and more expensive. At dawn on November the 25th, the Japanese offensive began, with columns advancing along multiple axes. On the western Xiangyang front, more than 1,000 troops from Tongyang and over 3,000 from Jingmen struck Hongjian and Yanzhimao, shattering the positions of the Chinese 30th Corps. Simultaneously, a column moving from Zhujiafu towards Tongling split into several detachments and drove deep northward into Liangshuijing, Xiajiazhu, and Kuihuopu. By nightfall, the River West Army Group had regrouped along the line from Hongjian through Yanzhimao to Huaihupo. On the 26th, the Japanese reached Xiangzhou. The following day, they assaulted Liuhoji and Lijiatang in a day-long battle that ended in a stalemate. At dusk, the 30th Corps launched a powerful counterattack. The 27th and 31st Divisions dispatched raiding parties into the enemy's rear. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Japanese fell back towards Jingmen and Zhongjiang, pursued by Chinese forces that inflicted heavy losses. Along the Jingmen-Jiangxiang Highway, the Japanese massed more than 3,000 troops to attack Jiangzhoujian and Wangjiajian, encircling Jiangjiaqi and Shahijian. The Chinese 149th Division withdrew in good order to the stronger Wangjiahu-Wulongguan line. On the 26th, the enemy strength grew to about 5,000. One column advanced on Sanligang, while the main body assaulted Peijiai, Wangjiahu, and Yunanmen. Fighting continued until dark without decisive results. On the 27th, the main force of the 44th Corps counterattacked from Wangjiahu, converging with the 67th Corps, advancing from the northwest. The coordinated assault inflicted severe casualties, yet the Japanese continued to fight stubbornly. On the Suixian front, more than 2,000 Japanese troops reached Liangshukou on the morning of the 25th, and then they launched a violent attack against the 123rd Division at Laishan. Two additional columns, each exceeding 1,000 men, pushed westwards towards Hoyuantan and Qingmingpu. Their numbers swelled steadily as the darkness fell. On the 26th, fierce combat raged against the 124th and 127th Division at Jinjishan and Qingmingpu. A separate force of about 800 men advanced from Xihe via Langhujian to Tangjaifan. After clashing with the 41st Corps, the Japanese near Qingmingpu linked up with those at Jinjiashan and moved towards Hoyuantan on the 27th. That night, the detachment at Tangjaifan reached the vicinity of Huantanjian, confronting the 125th Division. Recognizing that the enemy had become dangerously dispersed, the War Area Command ordered its units to hold critical localities while the main force exploited the mountainous terrain for ambushes. The tactic proved effective. Heavy fighting continued until the 28th, when the Japanese, unable to achieve their objectives, began a general withdrawal. Chinese forces west of Xiangyang immediately took up a pursuit. The enemy opposing the Right Army Group was routed and they retreated along several routes. In the Suixian sector, Japanese units at Hoyuantan and Wantianjian were caught in converging attacks by the Central Army Group, driven back to some high ground, and then they were encircled. In a desperate attempt to relieve their trapped forces, the Japanese rushed about 1,600 infantry and cavalry troops from Suixian and Yingshan through Shangxijian and Shaitan in a flanking maneuver, only to be ambushed once more. Covered by aircraft and armor, the enemy withdrew towards Suixian and Sihe as Chinese troops pressed forward along the line from Chunchuan to Anchu, Laishan, and Guaochang. By November the 30th, all Chinese army groups had restored themselves to their original positions. The Central Hubei operation produced uneven battlefield outcomes, particularly in reported casualties. Japanese accounts describe relatively limited losses, just 132 killed and 445 wounded, attributed to advantages in air superiority, artillery, and armored support, even though the advance was complicated by difficult terrain. At the same time, Japanese forces faced persistent Chinese counterattacks along the Han River, which contributed to localized pressure and eventual withdrawal. The Japanese reported 6,439 Chinese killed and 474 captured, but the evidence base is uncertain, and the language of reporting suggests possible exaggeration or even propaganda. Conversely, Chinese-era estimates reported placing the Japanese losses at roughly 5,000 killed and about 8,000 wounded, illustrating a substantial gap between competing narratives. Some alternate reconstructions suggest total Chinese casualties in the range of about 20 to 30,000, depending on whether wounded and missing personnel are included. However, because wartime reporting was quite fragmented and inconsistent, there is no fully verifiable casualty ledger for all the units involved. Despite these tolls, the operation did not appear to achieve a decisive Chinese destruction of the Japanese intended target force. The Chinese Fifth War area included elements associated with the 31st Army Group under Tang Embo. They suffered attrition but generally avoided annihilation. No major command-level losses are indicated in the surviving accounts, and the unit formations were not described as collapsing permanently. On the material side, Japan reported seizing rifles and supplies from positions that Chinese forces had encircled or abandoned in short term, but overall equipment losses for either side were described as limited, consistent with the operation's restricted intensity. Strategically, the operation offered Japan short-term tactical advantages, notably through localized developments and the temporary pressure of combined arms support. But it failed to translate these gains into a sustained strategic result. The fighting also strained Japanese logistics in central China, especially given that the offensive was not followed by major reinforcements at the same time. It exposed continuing vulnerabilities in rugged terrain where Chinese guerrilla activity and organized counteraction could offset superior firepower. Ultimately, the Central Hubei operation produced no net territorial gains. By the end of the week, Japanese troops had returned to positions that did not fundamentally alter control in Central Hubei. Local clashes may have disturbed formations and disrupted movement temporarily, but the campaign did not create durable forward bases, did not change administrative control meaningfully, and did not permanently disrupt key supply corridors. The territorial status quo largely persisted. The Chinese Fifth War area forces maintained positions north of the Yangtze River, and there was no widespread abandonment of strongholds sufficient to indicate a strategic collapse. In the months following the Japanese repulse in central Hubei, in November of 1940, enemy forces remained largely immobilized across the Jingxiang Plains, their early ambitions checked by determined Chinese resistance. Seeking to regain momentum and draw Chinese strength away from other theaters, the Japanese High Command prepared a massive offensive into southern Hunan in late January of 1941. By the end of the month, they had concentrated an imposing array of 7 infantry divisions, 1 independent cavalry brigade, 3 independent armored regiments, and 1 independent artillery regiment. In all, more than 150,000 infantrymen, over 8,000 cavalry, 550 artillery pieces, 300 tanks, and 200 armored cars stood ready. Over 100 aircraft were massed at forward bases in Anyang, Xinjiang, Huiyang, and Xinyang. From early January onwards, ammunition and equipment had been shipped up the Yangtze and moved inland to Xinyang, while Japanese reconnaissance planes repeatedly overflew Chinese rear areas. On the 20th of January, as a preliminary move to pin down Chinese forces and facilitate the main effort into central Hunan, the Japanese 18th Independent Mixed Brigade, together with elements of the 39th and 4th Divisions, launched a limited attack against the Chinese 29th and 33rd Army groups. The principal assault, however, began on the 24th of January, under the overall command of Lieutenant General Katsuchiro Enbu. The Japanese organized their Southern Hunan forces into three powerful columns. The left flank force, built around the entire 3rd Division, reinforced by the 8th Regiment of the 4th Division and the Mizumo Armored Unit, commanded by Lieutenant General Fusataro Hanjima of the 3rd Division. The central force, centered on the 17th Division, less than one regiment, and strengthened by the 67th Regiment of the 15th Division and the Yoshimatsu Armored Unit, commanded by Lieutenant General Amaya of the 40th Division. And the right flank force, formed around the main body of the 40th Division, which would also be led by Lieutenant General Amaya. In support of this main thrust, Japanese forces in northern Anhui and eastern Hunan, principally the 4th Cavalry Brigade, with the Hirabayashi Tank Regiment, advanced westward from Haozhou towards Woyang. The Uda Regiment of the 21st Division pushed west from Suzhou, while the Oguchi and Kobayashi regiments of the 35th Division, accompanied by engineer, cavalry, artillery, and tank units, moved from Kaifeng, Tongzhu, and Juxianjian along the northern bank of the Yellow River and through the flooded areas towards Jiangzhou. These supporting columns were intended to tie down Chinese reserves and prevent reinforcements on the southern front. The National Military Council in Chongqing correctly assessed the enemy's intent to drive north along the Beiping-Hankou Railway with their main strength, force a decisive battle against the Chinese field armies, then rely on the northern Anhui Eastern Hunan forces to strike westward in coordination. Accordingly, the Council instructed the Fifth War Area to avoid a costly frontal engagement. Instead, a small portion of its troops would offer delaying resistance along the railway, while the main force would maneuver to the enemy's flanks and rear, severing communications and launching devastating counterattacks. In compliance, the Fifth War Area left only a single division near Xiping on the Beiping-Hankou line. The bulk of its strength, carefully concealed in depth on both sides of the enemy's expected axis of advance, remained highly mobile, ready to strike the Japanese flanks or rear the moment the enemy divided his forces or pushed towards Runan, Yancheng, or Wuyang. At dawn on the 25th of January, the Japanese Southern Hunan forces advanced in their three columns. The left flank force moved along the line from Xiaolianjian to Gucheng and Chashan. The central force struck northwards from Mingang. The right flank crossed the Hui River between Huijuajian and Jiangyang under heavy air support. Japanese aircraft bombed Chinese positions relentlessly. True to the plan, Chinese units employed only light screening forces to harass the enemy with ambushes and flank attacks, preserving their main strength for the decisive moment. By the 26th, the Japanese had reached the line from Piyang to Guayi, Xinqian, and Chushan. On the 27th, they pressed on to Quanshui, Xiahijian, and Zhumandian. At this point, the Chinese mobile forces sprang to action. The 13th Corps of the 31st Army Group swung northwards towards Xianghuguan, while the main body of the 85th Corps moved towards Xiangtai to begin an enveloping maneuver. The 68th Corps of the 11th Army Group struck the enemy rear south of Xianghuguan. The 55th Corps advanced from Tonghu to Piyang, and the 59th Corps of the 33rd Army Group pushed towards Nanyang. On January the 29th, the 13th Corps attacked the Japanese left flank force near Jiuguanqing and Xiaoxijian south of Wuyang, while the 85th Corps struck the right flank force around Runan, southeast of Xiangtai. The enemy's central force, advancing along the western side of the railway, found the Chinese positions already evacuated and failed to trap any major units. The Japanese columns on the extreme flank suffered over 3,000 casualties and lost 6 tanks in the fighting. By January the 31st, the enemy, desperate to rescue their exposed flank columns, reordered their units. The central force executed turning movements on both sides. Elements of the 15th Division swung right from Suiping through Xiangtai to converge with troops moving north from Runan against the 85th Corps, while the main body of the 17th Division split into 2 columns and advanced from Suiping through Xiping towards Wuyang. Simultaneously, the main force of the 3rd Division and part of the 4th Division also converged on Wuyang, hoping to link up with the 17th Division and crush the 13th Corps near Jiuguanqing and Xiaoxijian. Before the trap could close, however, the Chinese 13th and 85th Corps would withdraw in good order to the area north of Yuxian, between Yanchang and Shangshui, north of the Sha River. When the Japanese broke through Wuyang and Shanghai, they found no major Chinese forces to destroy. Meanwhile, Chinese troops from western Hunan, the 59th, 55th, and 68th Corps, advanced from Tonghe, Piyang, and points north to strike the enemy near Wuyang. On the 29th, the 84th Corps and local guerrillas in western Anhui recaptured Tianyang and continued their pursuit. The Japanese, having failed to concentrate superior strength or control the battlefield, now found themselves isolated. Their rear communications were severed, and they were under constant pressure from the 68th, 55th, and 59th Corps. After days of exhausting combat, the enemy began to withdraw southward on the night of February the 2nd, leaving only rearguards at Wuyang and Baoanzhai to tie down the 13th Corps. The main body of the 3rd Division moved from Fangchang towards Nanyang and Jianping. The 13th Corps immediately counterattacked, recaptured Baoanzhai and Wuyang, pursued the enemy all the way towards Fangchang. On the night of February the 2nd, as the Japanese main force approached Nanyang, the 17th Division, together with elements of the 15th and 4th Divisions, had already pushed south from Wuyang via Xianghuguan towards Piyang, hoping to link with forces moving east from Nanyang to trap the Chinese 68th, 55th, and 29th Corps. Fierce resistance by the 68th Corps near Xianghuguan inflicted heavy losses and forced the enemy to abandon large quantities of supplies. Further south, the 29th Corps exacted still greater casualties around Piyang. On the night of the 7th, the trapped Japanese column split. Part retreated towards the Tanghe-Piyang Highway, while the main body withdrew along the Tongbo-Xinyang Highway towards Xinyang, leaving many dead behind. The Chinese 85th Corps pursued southeastwards, while elements of the 13th, 29th, and 55th, as well as the 59th Corps, harried the enemy towards Xinyang. By the time the fighting had ended, all of the Chinese units had gone back to their original positions. In coordination with the Southern Hunan Offensive, the Japanese forces in northern Anhui and eastern Hunan advanced westward in 4 columns on the morning of January the 25th. The Oda Regiment of the 21st Division struck west from Suzhou. The 4th Cavalry Brigade, reinforced by the Hirabayashi Tank Regiment, split into 3 routes from Bozhou to attack Woyang, Shanhuiqi, and Shuangqiao, clashing bitterly with a Chinese cavalry division around Chizhehe and Yaoqiuji. The Oguchi Regiment of the 35th Division advanced through the flooded areas from Tongxu and Shuxianjian, while the Kobayashi Regiment moved westward along the northern bank of the Yellow River near Zhangzhou. Japanese aircraft intensified their bombings of Chinese cities and frontline positions. On January the 29th, one enemy column reached Santaiji and suffered heavy losses under Chinese attack. Threatened on the left by forces near Huaiyang, 2 Chinese corps withdrew temporarily to a line from Fuyang to Taihe and Jushou. On February the 5th, the Japanese captured Taihe and Jushou, but a Chinese counterattack on the 6th regained both towns, forcing the enemy to retreat northeastwards. The Battle of Southern Hunan, which opened up on January the 25th and would conclude on February the 10th, after 17 days of continuous fighting, ended in a clear Chinese victory. Japanese casualties would exceed 9,000. When the enemy withdrew from Nanyang, more than 300 military vehicles were left burning on the battlefield. Large quantities of arms, ammunition, and supplies fell into Chinese hands. Chinese losses were significantly lighter. The enemy had hoped to force a decisive battle along the railway and shatter the Chinese armies of the Fifth War area. Instead, skillful Chinese maneuvers, timely flank attacks, and relentless pressure on the enemy's rear and communications had turned the Japanese offensive into a costly failure. The victory not only preserved the integrity of the central Chinese front, but it also demonstrated once again the effectiveness of elastic defense and mobile counteroffensive tactics against a numerically superior but overextended foe. Now, in the wake of their costly losses in central Hubei the previous November, and even more humiliating, their defeat in southern Hunan between late January and early February of 1941, the Japanese sought once more to regain the initiative in the spring of 1941. Their target was western Hubei, where Chinese forces continued to deny them freedom of movement along the middle Yangtze. The entire Japanese 13th Division garrisoning the Yichang salient had its regiments deployed in a defensive arc. The 65th Regiment and the 19th Artillery Regiment held positions east of the city at Longchuanpu, Tumenya, and Yachuling. The 104th Regiment guarded the northwest approaches, and the 17th Cavalry Regiment patrolled the Yangtze Baishanao sector. On the west bank of the Yangtze, the 58th Regiment had constructed strong bridgehead fortifications between Chaojiaoling and Shangwulongkou, ready to support any renewed thrust westward. Facing this entrenched enemy was the Chinese 26th Corps, entrusted with the critical mission of the river defense of the west bank of the Yangtze, opposite of Yichang. The Corps commander had organized his forces into 3 sectors. The 41st Division held the right zone, anchoring its line from Mujiaitian and Tanjia-Taiji northward to the vicinity of Fanjiahu. The 32nd Division defended the left zone, stretching from Mujiaitian through Siyang to Zhangqiukou. The 44th Division remained in corps reserve near Jiaojiafan, poised to reinforce either flank or exploit opportunities. On March the 6th of 1941, the Japanese struck. Having quietly reinforced their forces west of Yichang to more than 3 regiments, supported by cavalry and artillery, they opened the assault at about 5:30 a.m. And this was a violent artillery barrage, followed immediately by infantry advances under the cover of airstrikes. Chinese security positions at Tanjia-Taiji and Chaojiajian were overrun. The enemy hurled themselves against the main line at Changgangling. Simultaneously, about 700 Japanese troops, backed by aircraft and guns, assaulted Fanjiahu. After hours of bitter fighting, both localities would fall. On the morning of March the 7th, Japanese aircraft again spearheaded the attack, enabling the capture of positions at Chuanjiaitai and Wujiaiba. The enemy pressed on towards Chuanjiaichong and Yutaishan, but was thrown back. Meanwhile, the force that had already taken Fanjiahu clashed fiercely with the Chinese 44th Division. This was around Taiping-Chao. Although the division was eventually compelled to withdraw to the eastern end of a bridge under relentless air attacks, it continued to resist stubbornly. Seizing the moment, the River Defense Force reorganized its lines. The 103rd Division of the 8th Corps relieved the sector from Mujiaitang through Yingzhushan to Chaqiangguan, while the 26th Corps consolidated new positions at Yutaishan, Pijiaishan, Qingshuba, Guanggongling, and Xiaopingshanba. The plan was clear: hold the enemy east of the line, then launch a converging counterstroke to destroy the invaders and restore the original front. On March the 8th, 2 guerrilla columns from the 41st Division struck Changgangling and Faijiayuan, while another detachment hit the enemy east of Pifangjian. More than 2,000 Japanese troops assaulted the 44th Division's positions from Gaolingpo and Dajiaobian towards Wanghu Zhejiang. Determined resistance by the 44th Division, supported by elements of the 41st, brought the attack to a standstill. Later that day, the enemy managed to penetrate the 32nd Division's lines, and that was at Tanwangshi, forcing Chinese troops to fight a delaying action along the outskirts of the Shibai Fortress from Mingchaichong to Hutango. Dawn of March the 9th brought renewed Chinese initiative. The 103rd Division occupied the line from Douyiling to Shizunao and advanced in several columns against the enemy. A portion of the 44th Division waged a grim holding action on the high ground flanking Guojiaiba, suffering heavy losses but buying time for the main body to launch a powerful flank attack against the Japanese at Taiping-Chao and Xianglingkou. By dusk, the Chinese forces had captured the enemy strong points at Dujiaoba and Dujiaobian along the highway, annihilating numerous enemy troops. The 32nd Division threw its main strength against the area northwest of Daijiabian, and heavy fighting would range around Wanghu Zhejiang well into the afternoon until enemy reinforcements were driven off. The 41st Division, meanwhile, executed effective flank attacks that yielded significant gains. On March the 10th, the 103rd Division recaptured the high ground around Xiaowulongkou and north of Tianzipo, while guerrillas of the 41st Division continued to harass the enemy through every gap in his lines. When positions at Hongqipo and Longtamping held by the 44th Division were breached, the division withdrew to the western heights of Baomuping and then faced the enemy anew. At dawn on March the 11th, after suffering severe casualties, the Japanese resorted to smokescreens and then they began withdrawing eastward along separate routes. Chinese pursuit forces swiftly retook Xianglingkou, Guojiaiba, Guangongling, Tianwangxu, and Daijiabian. By March the 12th, the enemy had fallen back to a defensive line running from the eastern parts of Taipingqiao to Huijiai. On the 13th, Chinese units launched general counterattacks. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Japanese retreated to their original positions. The 8-day engagement thus ended exactly where it had begun. The battle had been fought with only a portion of the available Chinese forces, yet it proved decisive. The Japanese, who had hoped to crack the river defenses and resume their westward drive, instead suffered nearly 5,000 casualties. The swift and skillful Chinese counteroffensive not only restored the front, but left the enemy shaken and apprehensive. Their design to push deeper into western Hubei was decisively thwarted, buying precious time for broader Chinese war efforts in Yangtze theater, and demonstrating once again that determined defense, timely reinforcements, and aggressive counteraction could blunt even the most carefully prepared Japanese offensive. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. After all that, you're still hungry for some more history? Why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. If you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In November of 1940, a central Hubei operation using 5 task forces attempted to exploit Chinese dispersal, but achieved no territorial gains despite local successes. A larger January 1941 offensive into Southern Hunan deployed 150,000 troops, but failed strategically. Despite Japanese tactical advantages and superior firepower, logistical constraints and rugged terrain favored Chinese mobility and resistance. Both campaigns ended with Japanese withdrawals and restored Chinese positions, demonstrating that determined defense and timely counteraction could blunt large-scale Japanese operations.